Imagine, just for a second, that you're standing at your kitchen sink. You reach out, you turn the handle, and, clear, cold water just pours right out.
Yeah, it's something we do a dozen times a day without even thinking about it.
Exactly. Or maybe imagine you're driving down Interstate 5, right through California's Central Valley, and it's like the blazing heat of July, right?
Yeah, over 100 degrees easily out there.
Right. And you look out the window, and you just see these vast, endless fields of brilliant green. I'm talking almonds, pistachios, tomatoes, just stretching all the way to the horizon.
It really does look like a modern miracle when you drive past it.
It does. And, well, from an engineering standpoint, it totally is. Because what you are looking at is the most elaborate, heavily engineered water delivery system on the face of the earth. But today, on this deep dive, we're going to look underneath the hood of that miracle.
Yeah, we're going to get into the structural history of California's massive water plumbing system.
Right. But we're doing it by looking incredibly closely at two very crucial elements that this entire dazzling empire was basically designed to completely ignore.
And it is a pretty sobering reality to confront, honestly, because to truly understand what this water system is, you have to understand who and what it displaced.
Yeah.
We're looking at a deeply structural history of dispossession and really profound ecological loss. And we're going to focus on two very specific claimants, the cold water salmon and the native nations of California.
And when you say claimants, just to clarify for everyone listening, we are talking about a very specific legal and biological status here, right?
Yes, exactly. Both the fish and the tribes represent what you would call first and in-stream claimants.
Okay, so first meaning, well, their presence, and in the case of the tribes, their actual rights predate almost every single modern water diversion in the state.
Every concrete dam, every irrigation canal, they were there first.
Right, and in-stream is the other half of that equation, right?
Yeah, in-stream is crucial. For the salmon to survive biologically and for tribal rights to be fulfilled practically and culturally, the water actually needs to be left in the river.
It can't just be siphoned off into some concrete aqueduct hundreds of miles away.
Right, it has to stay in the stream, which fundamentally changes how you look at a map of the state.
It really does, because 20th century California essentially built its entire agricultural and urban empire by treating rivers as pipes.
Just industrial conduits, really, designed to move a commodity from point A to point B.
And it just assumed that those senior claimants simply didn't exist.
Structurally speaking, the architecture of the state, both the legal architecture and the actual physical concrete architecture, was built directly over the top of them.
So to grasp the mechanics of how that happened and the immense consequences we're still dealing with today, we essentially have to trace the water.
We do. We have to move chronologically and geographically.
Right. So here's the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to start with the hidden legal foundations that were laid down back in the 1850s.
Then we'll travel upstream, high into the mountains, to look at the massive concrete megadams.
And after that, we'll follow whatever surviving water there is downstream right into the enormous river-reversing export pumps in the Delta,
before finally arriving at a cautiously hopeful present on the Klamath River,
where a massive undamming project is basically testing the very limits of ecological healing.
It's a journey that really reveals the massive, often heartbreaking gap between the rights written on paper and the reality of what actually flows through the rivers.
Let's start at the very foundation of that gap, then. We have to go back to a very specific, totally chaotic window of time.
The gold rush.
Exactly. The gold rush is radically reshaping the landscape and the population of the American West. The years are 1851 and 1852.
California had just become a state in 1850.
Right. So hundreds of thousands of people are just flooding in from all over the world, desperate for wealth, for land, and obviously for water.
And the demographic and environmental shock of that moment really cannot be overstated. It was absolute upheaval.
And right in the middle of all that chaos, the federal government sent commissioners out to California to do, well, what it traditionally did when the U.S. expanded its territory.
Right. They went out to negotiate treaties with the indigenous population.
So between 1851 and 1852, these federal agents negotiated 18 separate treaties with over 130 bands of California tribes.
18 treaties.
Yeah.
Over 130 distinct bands.
That is just a massive, sprawling diplomatic undertaking, especially across such incredibly rugged, varied terrain.
It was.
So what were the actual terms being laid out in these documents? Like, what was the deal?
Well, the core of the treaties followed a pretty familiar federal pattern for the time. The tribes were essentially asked to cede their vast ancestral territories, which was the bulk of the new state, in exchange for the promise of reserved lands, goods, and federal protections.
Okay.
Specifically, the treaties promised roughly 7.5 million acres of land as permanent, federally protected reservations.
Okay, wait, just to put that in perspective for you listening. 7.5 million acres is roughly an eighth of the entire state of California.
It's a very substantial land base.
Yeah, it implies a sovereign future,
Yeah.
a recognized territorial footprint for the native nations within the new boundaries of the state.
That was the promise. That was what the commissioners and the tribal leaders signed. But the mechanism of what happened next is where this history takes a uniquely devastating turn.
Because the state didn't actually want to give up that land, did they?
No, not at all. The California delegation in Washington, D.C., who were representing this new, booming settler population, they fiercely objected to these treaties.
I mean, I can guess why. You have a gold rush happening. You have a massive influx of people wanting to build farms and cities.
Right.
They looked at that 7.5 million acres, and they probably saw timber, gold, prime agricultural soil, and crucial watersheds.
Exactly. Their argument was incredibly blunt. They lobbied the federal government and just insisted that the land promised to the tribes was simply too valuable.
Too valuable, wow.
Yeah. They argued that locking away an eighth of the state would kneecap California's economic potential before it even really started.
So they basically decided that honoring the diplomatic agreements they just made was too costly for their own ambitions.
That's the long and short of it.
But how did they actually stop the treaties from taking effect?
Right.
I mean, treaties have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, right? Did they just hold a vote and publicly shoot them down?
You'd think so, but no. They did something completely unprecedented. In July of 1852, the United States Senate took up these 18 treaties.
Okay.
And rather than debating them publicly on the Senate floor or even just conventionally voting them down and sending the commissioners back to renegotiate, the Senate secretly rejected all 18 treaties.
Wait, secretly rejected them?
Yes.
They didn't just deny the ratification, they actively buried the evidence of the agreement.
Exactly. They placed the documents under what is formally known in the Senate as an injunction of secrecy.
An injunction of secrecy.
Yeah. It's a formal legislative lock and key. The treaties were sealed away in the Senate files, completely hidden from public view.
Oh my God.
And the tribes were never formally notified that the agreements they had signed in good faith had been voided.
Just think about the implications of that for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine signing a contract that requires you to give up your home, your land, your entire ancestral territory, all in exchange for a new, secure place to live.
Right.
You hold up your end of the deal, you cede the territory, and the other party just takes your signature, locks the contract in a vault, throws away the key, and pretends the entire conversation never even happened.
And they maintained that pretense for over half a century.
Half a century.
Yeah, that injunction of secrecy remained in place until 1905.
Wow.
It was roughly 50 years later that a clerk actually discovered them in a drawer, and a senator named Thomas Bard finally had the injunction lifted, which allowed the documents to finally surface.
50 years. I mean, that is multiple generations of people living and dying. For half a century, the state of California is building its foundational wealth. It's building its cities, its vast agricultural empires, and most importantly for our deep dive today, its incredibly complex water rights system.
Yes, exactly.
And it is doing all of that on top of land that was taken through a completely unratified, literally hidden deception.
The uniquely Californian catastrophe that this created is just profound, because if you look at other parts of the American West, tribes were obviously also dispossessed, often brutally.
Right.
But many of them eventually ended up with ratified treaties that secured at least some defined reservation boundary. But because the California treaties were sealed, the tribes here ceded their claims but received absolutely nothing in return.
Just totally left in limbo.
Right. For decades, they were left without a treaty-secured land base.
And if we were talking about water today, why does that missing land base matter so much? Like, I know land and water are connected, but how does the legal mechanism actually work there?
To understand that, we really have to look at a massive shift in the legal landscape that happens right around the exact same time these secret treaties are finally seeing the light of day.
Okay.
We have to introduce a legal concept called the Winters Doctrine.
The Winters Doctrine. This is a totally foundational piece of Western water law. It stems from a 1908 Supreme Court case called Winters v. United States.
That's the one.
But this case didn't actually happen in California, did it?
No, it originated up in Montana, involving the Gros Ventre and Assiniboine tribes of the Fort Belknap Reservation, but its legal shockwaves ended up dictating the water rights of every single reservation in the country.
So what was the core dispute there?
The core dispute was about the Milk River, which bordered the reservation.
Okay, set the scene for us. What was happening on the Milk River in 1908?
Well, the federal government had established the Fort Belknap Reservation to supposedly encourage the tribes to transition to agriculture. But upstream from the reservation, white settlers were diverting the water from the Milk River to irrigate their own farms.
Like a lot of water.
So much water. They were pulling so much water out that the river was effectively drying up by the time it even reached the reservation.
Wow. And the settlers' argument was based on state law, right? That classic Western rule of prior appropriation.
Yes. Prior appropriation is essentially the law of the mining camps applied to hydrology.
First in time, first in right.
Exactly. It translates to first in time, first in right. The settlers argued, look, we built our diversion ditches first under Montana state law. We put the water to beneficial use, therefore the water is legally ours.
Which is how Western water law usually works.
Right. And they also pointed out that the treaty establishing the Fort Belknap Reservation didn't explicitly mention water rights. The word water wasn't really in there.
So if I'm a settler, I'm thinking I followed the rules, I dug my ditch, I claimed the water. How does the Supreme Court justify overriding that state claim?
The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States, who was acting on behalf of the tribes, by using a brilliantly logical piece of reasoning. They established the principle of implied reservation.
Implied reservation.
Yeah. The court basically said that when the federal government sets aside a tract of arid western land for a reservation, it implicitly reserves enough water to fulfill the purpose of that reservation.
Because, I mean, giving someone a piece of land in Montana or California and telling them to farm it without giving them a right to the water is effectively a death sentence.
You cannot farm dust.
Right, you literally cannot farm dust.
That was precisely the court's logic. Even if the word water was never written in the treaty itself, the water is legally permanently bound to the land.
That makes total sense.
It does. And here is the most powerful part of the Winters Doctrine, and this is crucial for California. It's the priority date.
Oh, explain how the priority date works in this context.
Yeah.
Because in prior appropriation, the date is everything, right? It determines who gets shut off first in a drought.
Exactly. Under the Winters Doctrine, the priority date for tribal water rights is the date the reservation was created.
Wow.
Not the date a pipe was laid, not the date a canal was dug, but the date the sovereign land base was established by the federal government.
First in time, first in right.
Yep.
And because these reservations were typically established in the 19th century, long before the massive state and federal water projects of the 20th century even existed, these tribal Winters rights are theoretically senior to nearly every modern farm and city diversion in the West.
They hold the absolute oldest place in line.
That is wild.
And that principle was powerfully reinforced decades later in 1963 in a massive Supreme Court case called Arizona v. California. The court applied the Winters Doctrine to the tribes along the lower Colorado River and confirmed that they possessed extremely large, highly senior entitlements to the river's water.
Based purely on the establishment dates of their reservations.
Precisely.
Okay, hold on. If I'm listening to this, I'm putting the pieces together and I'm very confused.
I don't blame you.
Right. Because the tribes have the oldest, most senior, quote-unquote, paper rights in the country. The Supreme Court backed them up in 1908 and again in 1963. So why aren't the native nations the ones actually controlling California's water today?
It's the big question.
It sounds like they are holding a winning lottery ticket from 1851, but the bank just absolutely refuses to cash it.
That is literally the perfect analogy. And the reason the bank won't cash it, it comes down to a really crucial distinction in water law, the difference between a right on paper and what lawyers call wet water.
Let's define wet water. What is that?
Wet water is water you can actually use.
Okay.
It's water you can physically divert into a canal or legally protect to leave in stream for the fish. It is realized, quantifiable water. And the gap between paper rights and wet water for California tribes is an absolute chasm.
And I'm guessing it leads directly back to those sealed treaties of 1851.
It does. It leads right back to that locked drawer. Because you can't have a Winters right attached to a reservation if the Senate secretly ensured your reservation never legally existed.
Oh, wow. So because the treaties were secretly rejected, many California tribes today are either federally unrecognized or entirely landless.
Exactly the problem. And if the federal government doesn't recognize your sovereign status, or if you have no federally reserved land base, you generally cannot assert a winter's right.
The legal anchor was just totally stolen from them.
It was. The legacy of the Senate's secret injunction is still, right now, today, actively denying water to tribes.
But wait, what about the tribes in California that do have recognized reservations? There are federally recognized tribes in the state. Why aren't they dictating the flow of the rivers based on their senior rights?
Well, even for tribes with recognized reservations and indisputable winter's rights, the process of turning that theoretical paper right into wet water is agonizingly difficult because most of these tribal rights in California remain entirely unquantified.
Unquantified, meaning, well, the Supreme Court says they have a right to enough water to fulfill the reservation's purpose, but nobody has ever legally defined how many gallons it actually is.
Yes. The law provides a concept, but it doesn't provide a number. And before we go further, it really helps to understand how we measure this water. In Western water law, we don't usually talk in gallons. We talk in acre-feet.
Right, acre-feet. For you listening, an acre-foot is literally what it sounds like. Imagine a football field, which is roughly an acre, and cover the entire thing in water 1 foot deep.
That is 1 acre-foot.
Which equates to about 326,000 gallons. It's generally considered enough water to supply 2 average households for an entire year.
So the tribes have a right to a certain amount of acre-feet, but that number is blank.
It's just a blank check.
Yeah, and to fill in that blank, to quantify those rights usually requires either massive, decades-long litigation in federal court or incredibly complex, fraught settlements with the state and federal government.
Because if a tribe steps forward and says, hey, actually, according to the Supreme Court in 1908, we own the first 100,000 acre-feet of this river, they're essentially threatening the entire foundation of the modern California water economy.
They absolutely are.
Because the state built its entire agricultural industry on the assumption that the tribal water was just, freely available for the taking.
It's viewed as an existential threat by the junior water users.
The junior users being the massive irrigation districts in the Central Valley and the sprawling cities down south.
Exactly. Furthermore, the legal hurdles just keep shifting. Recently, federal courts have even found that some tribes lack the legal standing to sue to quantify their own reserved rights without the federal government stepping in to act on their behalf.
That is infuriating. So they are just trapped in this bureaucratic and legal labyrinth. The state won't give them the water because it's already using it, and the courts make it nearly impossible to force the issue.
Which is why, increasingly, litigation is being abandoned in favor of negotiation. Tribes are basically forced into bargaining, trying to secure their rights settlement by settlement.
Just clawing it back.
It is a slow, grueling, incredibly expensive process of trying to carve out a sliver of wet water from a system that was intentionally designed from the 1850s onward to exclude them entirely.
It is a totally stunning foundation of legal dispossession.
Mm-hmm.
The legal architecture was built directly over the top of the tribal claims, effectively just erasing them from the map.
But the law is only half the story here.
Right, because once the state decided on paper that the tribes didn't own the water, engineers were suddenly free to start pouring concrete right across the rivers.
Which brings us to the physical reality of the rivers themselves. We're moving from the legal engineering of the 19th century to the physical, structural engineering of the mid-20th century.
The era of the mega dams.
Yes, the massive concrete walls.
So let's trace the water upstream. We are leaving the courtrooms and heading high up into the volcanic, spring-fed streams of the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada.
The historical domain of the cold water salmon.
Exactly. This is pristine, beautiful country. And the physical architecture that California built to, quote-unquote, tame this water essentially consists of dropping massive concrete walls right across the state's largest rivers.
The keystones of this physical architecture are the major dams of the Central Valley Project. Two of the most emblematic are Frant Dam on the San Joaquin River in the south, which was completed in 1942, and Shasta Dam on the upper Sacramento River in the north, completed in 1945.
Let's talk about the core purpose of these colossal structures. Because they weren't built by accident. They did exactly what they were engineered to do.
Their primary purpose was incredibly straightforward and economically vital: sever the rivers to capture the massive influx of winter and spring runoff.
Right, because in California, most of the precipitation falls in the winter as snow in the mountains.
Exactly. So the dams store that melting snow in giant reservoirs, hold it, and then release it slowly during the bone-dry summer months for agricultural irrigation down in the Central Valley.
It's basically a giant unnatural battery for water.
They fundamentally transformed wild seasonal rivers into highly regulated year-round industrial delivery canals.
But the biological cost of turning a wild river into a delivery canal is just staggering. Let's look at the salmonids, the Chinook salmon, and the steelhead.
Yeah, these are anadromous fish.
Anadromous, right, meaning they evolved over millennia to hash in fresh water, migrate out to the ocean to grow huge and strong, and then return.
And they navigate by the unique chemical smell of their natal streams.
Which is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
They migrate all the way back up through the valleys and high into the cold mountainous reaches to spawn and lay their eggs.
And when you drop a 600-foot concrete wall across a river, you completely sever that ancient migratory loop.
It's just a wall.
It is. The numbers provided by NOAA Fisheries outline a completely catastrophic biological loss. When dams like Shasta and Friant went up, they didn't include fish ladders.
Wait,
They were simply dead ends.
why wouldn't they include fish ladders? I mean, was it just an oversight? Did they forget?
No, it wasn't an oversight. It was a combination of engineering limitations at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it is very hard to build a functional fish ladder over a dam as tall as Shasta, and a really profound disregard for the biological value of the fish compared to the economic value of the water.
So they just didn't care enough to try.
Essentially, yes. As a result, NOAA estimates that these dams walled off Central Valley salmonids from an astonishing 90 to 95% of their historical spawning habitat.
90 to 95%.
Yes.
Gone overnight. Almost all of their high country, spring-fed spawning gravels, the places their ancestors returned to for literally thousands of years, were suddenly locked behind hundreds of feet of solid concrete.
And the devastation was absolutely immediate. Let's look closely at Friant Dam, completed in 1942.
Yep.
When they closed the massive steel gates on Friant, they diverted the water so completely into the Friant-Kern irrigation canal that they literally dewatered roughly 60 miles of the main stem of the San Joaquin River below the dam.
Hold on, 60 miles?
Yeah.
Just to make sure I am visualizing this correctly. They didn't just reduce the flow. They turned 60 miles of a major historic California river into a dry sandbox.
A completely dry sandbox. The river ceased to exist for a massive stretch.
Wow.
And by doing so, they completely unequivocally extinguished the entire run of San Joaquin spring run Chinook salmon.
Just wiped them out.
Yep. That specific, genetically unique run of fish, perfectly adapted to that specific river system, was wiped off the face of the earth because the water they needed to survive was simply turned off.
Total erasure. That is the legacy of Friant.
It is.
But let's travel north, up to Shasta Dam on the upper Sacramento River, because the dynamic there is a bit different, and in some ways, the engineering required to keep the fish alive there is even more precarious.
Much more precarious.
Here is where we need to narrow our focus down from millions of acre-feet of water right down to a tiny, incredibly crucial biological metric, a simple thermometer reading,
We're talking about 56 degrees Fahrenheit.
about 13 degrees Celsius.
That single temperature threshold is the entire biological drama of the Sacramento River winter run Chinook encapsulated in a single number.
The winter run Chinook are biologically fascinating, by the way, and they're currently listed as federally endangered. Historically, before the dam, they spawned way up in the McCloud River in the upper Sacramento, high above where Shasta Dam sits today. What makes them so unique?
Well, it's the timing of their life cycle. As their name suggests, they return from the ocean to fresh water in the winter and early spring.
Right.
But they hold in the river for months, and they actually spawn. They dig their nests in the gravel and lay their eggs during the blazing heat of the California summer.
And that is the biological tightrope, right? Because they are laying delicate eggs in the middle of July and August. And those incubating eggs absolutely require cold water.
They do. If the water flowing through the gravel incubating those eggs rises above roughly 56 degrees Fahrenheit for any sustained period, the biochemistry of the egg just fails.
The proteins literally break down.
Exactly. The eggs essentially suffocate and die before they ever even hatch.
Historically, this wasn't a problem, though, right? Because they spawned so high up in the mountainous reaches, shaded by towering canyons where icy volcanic springs and snowmelt kept the water freezing cold all summer long.
Right. No matter how hot the air temperature got up there, the water was ice cold. But Shasta Dam blocked access to all of that historic cold water habitat.
So now, The entire endangered population of winter-run Chinook is forced to spawn in the main stem of the Sacramento River, directly below the dam, right in the middle of the scorching Central Valley summer.
Where ambient air temperatures can easily sit above 100 degrees for weeks.
Which means their survival is completely unnatural at this point.
It relies entirely on human intervention and engineering. The mechanism of their survival is utterly dependent on what reservoir operators call the cold water pool.
Okay, explain the physics of this cold water pool. How does a massive reservoir sitting in the summer sun actually stay cold?
It's essentially a thermal layer cake.
A layer cake.
Yeah. Because Shasta is such an incredibly deep reservoir, the sun really only heats the top layer of the water. Cold water is denser and heavier than warm water.
Right, Science Class 101.
Exactly. So deep down at the very bottom of the lake, hundreds of feet below the surface, the water remains incredibly cold, trapped in a massive icy layer.
The hypolimnion, to use the technical term, is basically a giant underwater refrigerator.
That's a great way to think of it. And to save the salmon, engineers actually retrofitted Shasta Dam with massive, multi-million-dollar temperature control gates.
Like giant steel shutters, right?
Exactly. Colossal steel shutters that can slide up and down the deep face of the dam. These gates can reach deep down and selectively sip that freezing water from the bottom of the lake, releasing it downstream to act like a giant artificial air conditioner for the spawning gravels miles below.
So an entire federally endangered species is basically living on mechanical life support.
They are.
They were totally dependent on a thermostat controlled by dam operators who were constantly balancing agricultural needs with biological necessities.
It's a terrifyingly fragile system. And for a while, in wet years, when it was carefully managed, it worked to keep the species hanging on by a thread.
But then the system failed.
To understand that vulnerability, we have to look at the catastrophic drought from 2012 to 2016.
Right, because what happens when you put an entire species on mechanical life support inside a hospital? But the hospital's backup generator is controlled by the weather, and the weather just decides not to rain for 4 years.
Yeah. In a severe multi-year drought, the reservoir levels drop drastically. The overall volume of water shrinks, meaning the sun penetrates deeper and heats the water much faster.
Makes sense.
During the 2012 to 2016 drought, Shasta's cold water pool simply ran short. That deep, icy thermal layer at the bottom was just exhausted.
The bank account went to zero.
The dam operators essentially had no choice. To keep generating power and meeting downstream water quality and agricultural demands, they ran out of cold water and they began releasing warm water down into the salmon spawning reaches.
Above that lethal 56-degree mark.
Well above it. The eggs were incubating in the gravel, completely helpless, and the warm water just swept over them for weeks. The statistics from the worst years of that drought are just devastating. NOAA technical analyses estimated that the winter-run egg-to-fry mortality hit an astonishing 95 to 98%.
95 to 98% mortality.
Almost total loss.
That is almost a complete wipeout of an entire generation of a federally endangered species. And they weren't killed by predators or pollution or overfishing in the ocean. They were killed by a thermostat that the dam could no longer hold because the water had been allocated elsewhere or simply didn't exist in the system anymore.
It highlights the extreme fragility of a future where biological realities are constantly pitted against modern agricultural water demands. The dam's release schedules are fundamentally dictated by the need to deliver water to the Central Valley farms and cities.
So the historical needs of the salmon are just treated as an operational constraint.
A secondary consideration, yeah, not the primary purpose of the river.
So what happens now? If the cold water pool is a finite resource that drought can just bankrupt, and climate change is obviously only making droughts hotter and longer, how do we save the winter run from extinction?
Well, there are some desperate measures being explored. One of the most significant, and definitely controversial, is an active, really unproven experiment called trap and haul.
Okay, unpack the logistics of trap and haul, because when I first heard about this, it sounded like science fiction.
It kind of is. The idea is to physically capture the adult winter-run salmon as they swim up to the impassable base of Shasta Dam.
Okay.
You collect them in holding facilities, load them into specialized, aerated, temperature-controlled tanker trucks, and literally drive them around the 600-foot dam.
You put the fish in a truck.
Yes. You haul them miles up into the cold, historical, high-country tributaries like the McCloud River and release them to spawn naturally.
Okay, so you've driven the adults upstream. They spawn. The eggs hatch. But now you have millions of tiny baby salmon in the high country, and they need to migrate back to the ocean.
Yeah.
How do they get past the dam on the way down?
That is the incredibly complex part. You have to install massive netting systems and collection facilities in the rivers above the reservoir to catch the tiny baby salmon before they get lost or eaten in the lake.
Wow.
Then you load the babies into different trucks, drive them back down the mountain below the dam, and release them so they can continue their migration to the ocean.
So we are literally trucking salmon back and forth around a colossal concrete wall because we fundamentally broke the river.
Yes.
It's just a staggering image of where our plumbing system has left us.
It is an immense, incredibly expensive, and technologically fraught effort just to bypass the architecture we built. And whether it can actually establish a self-sustaining population rather than just being a permanent human-managed zoo exhibit in the wild remains a very open, hotly contested scientific question.
So we've seen how the plumbing system blocks the high country, how it kills the spring run by completely dewatering the river, and how it cooks the winter run by exhausting the cold water.
Yeah.
But let's follow the water that actually does get released. Let's follow those surviving baby salmon as they migrate downstream, out of the rivers and toward the ocean. Because the engineering challenges don't end at the dams. In fact, they get weirder, larger, and way more mechanically overwhelming.
We are moving now to the absolute hinge of the entire California plumbing system, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta.
The Delta.
Yes. This is the massive, complex estuary where the major rivers from the north and the south converge, mixing fresh water with the tidal salt water of the San Francisco Bay before flowing out to the Pacific Ocean.
And it is here in the Delta that the water we carefully stored behind Shasta in the north has to be captured and redirected to the massive farms and cities in the arid southern half of the state.
Exactly. The Delta is the transfer point, and the engines of that redirection are located in the southern part of the Delta.
The pumps.
Yes, there are two enormous pumping plants, the Federal Central Valley Project's Jones pumping plant and the State Water Project's Banks pumping plant.
I really want the listener to grasp the scale here. These aren't just water pumps like you have in a basement sump or a municipal water tower. These are monumental industrial feats of engineering.
Ew.
Their function is to physically lift millions of gallons of fresh water out of the sea level delta channels and push it hundreds of feet vertically up into massive concrete aqueducts, the California Aqueduct and the Delta Mendota Canal, that run for hundreds of miles south down the belly of the state.
And the sheer power of these pumps creates a stunning, almost unbelievable physical reality in the Delta.
Yeah, this part is wild.
At times of high export rates, when the pumps are running at near capacity to meet the relentless demands of the South, they are powerful enough to physically reverse the natural downstream flow in South Delta channels.
Wait, I need to stop you.
Yeah.
We literally force rivers to run backward. Like, we built machines so phenomenally powerful that they overpower the natural gravity-fed flow of a river toward the ocean and pull a massive volume of water backward toward the machinery.
Yes. Specifically in waterways like old and middle rivers, it is a hydraulic reality. Instead of the water flowing west toward the San Francisco Bay and the ocean, the immense suction from the massive impellers at the Jones and Banks plants pulls the water south, deep into the interior of the Delta, directly toward the intakes.
Okay, put yourself in the perspective of a migrating salmon smolt for a second. You are a tiny fish, maybe 3 inches long. You've somehow survived the warm water below Shasta. You've evaded predators for hundreds of miles down the Sacramento River, and you are trying to reach the ocean to complete your life cycle.
Right.
These fish use the flow of the water as a compass. They orient themselves to swim with the flow downstream.
Right.
What does a migrating salmon do when its fundamental compass suddenly betrays it? When the river it's following flows the wrong way, pulling it away from the ocean and directly toward a giant industrial intake.
It creates a lethal, totally confusing maze. The reversed flows entirely disorient the migrating salmon. They get pulled off their natural migratory routes and drawn deep into the unnatural channels of the South Delta.
And what happens to them there?
Once they are pulled in there, the water quality is often much poorer. Non-native predators like striped bass and largemouth bass are abundant. And ultimately, the flow leads directly to the massive metal louvers, the screens, and the grinding impellers of the pumping plants themselves.
But the salmon aren't the only ones caught in this massive reverse current. And to truly understand the ecological collapse of the Delta, we have to look at a fish that most people have never even heard of.
Very true.
It isn't famous, it isn't prized by sport fishermen, it isn't served in restaurants, but it has become the ultimate, highly politicized symbol of the entire system's failure. We need to talk about the Delta smelt.
Hyponesis transpacificus. The Delta smelt is a tiny, almost translucent fish, only about the length of your index finger.
Super small.
Yeah. It has a lifespan of only 1 year, and it is entirely endemic to the Delta, meaning it exists naturally nowhere else on planet Earth.
It's the ultimate local, a completely unique piece of biodiversity.
Sure.
And for a long time, before the massive expansion of the pumps, it was incredibly successful, right?
Historically, it was a cornerstone of the ecosystem. It was once the most abundant open water fish in the entire delta
Wow.
because of its sheer abundance and its extreme sensitivity to environmental changes, specifically water quality, and flow biologists considered it the ultimate indicator species for the health of the estuary.
A bellwether.
Exactly. If the smelt were thriving, it meant the complex, brackish mixing zone of the delta was functioning naturally. If the smelt crashed, it meant the system was fundamentally broken.
And crash they did, spectacularly. How does the delta's most abundant fish become a ghost? It comes back to the difference between the salmon and the smelt, biologically speaking.
Right. The biology of the smelt makes them uniquely vulnerable to the South Delta pumps. Unlike an adult salmon, which is an incredibly strong, directed swimmer, the Delta smelt is a pelagic fish.
Pelagic.
Yes. Pelagic in this context means they live in the open water column, and they are relatively weak swimmers. They largely just drift and move with the prevailing currents and tides.
So when the pumps turn on and reverse the flows in the South Delta, the smelt just don't have the physical strength to swim against that unnatural current and escape.
Exactly. They are simply pulled along with the water.
They are drawn directly into the export zone.
The technical term biologists use is entrainment. They're entrained by the flow. Once they are pulled toward the pumps, they are either killed directly by the immense pressure and machinery of the pumps, or they're diverted by screens into massive salvage facilities.
Salvage facilities, like fish rescue.
Sort of, but for a delicate fish like a smelt, the stress of the salvage process, the handling, and the concentrated predation in the salvage holding tanks means mortality is incredibly high. Throughout the 2000s, as pumping increased, the population of Delta smelt collapsed dramatically.
And where does the population stand today?
Well, by roughly 2020, standard trawl surveys conducted by biologists across the Delta were catching zero smelt. Month after month, zero. They have effectively vanished from the wild.
Vanished. Functionally extinct in the wild. An entire species that defined an ecosystem, sustained now almost entirely as a highly managed refuge population in specialized biosecure hatcheries, just hoping one day the river is safe enough to put them back.
The indicator species indicated a total catastrophic system failure, and then it literally disappeared.
Now here is where we must maintain strict scientific impartiality, because we are wading into what is arguably the single most contentious, litigious, scientific and political debate in California water politics.
Oh, absolutely.
The billion-dollar controversy. It is genuinely contested among scientists and water agencies exactly how much of the smelt and salmon decline is due directly and solely to the pumps.
That is a very critical nuance. We have to be clear, the ecosystem of the Delta has been radically altered over a century by human activity, and the water agencies point to multiple compounding factors that have driven the smelt to the brink.
It's not just one thing.
No. First, we have suffered through severe, climate-driven, multi-year droughts that drastically shrink the amount of fresh water flowing into the system. Second, the waters of the Delta are physically warming due to global climate change, making it inhospitable for cold water species.
And there was a massive biological invasion happening at the bottom of the food web, too.
Yes, a devastating invasion of non-native clams, specifically the overbite clam. These clams were likely introduced through the ballast water of international cargo ships traversing the San Francisco Bay.
Oh, wow.
They filter feed so aggressively, pulling microscopic plankton out of the water, that they have literally stripped the base of the food web bare. They are starving the estuary, leaving almost nothing for the smelt or the juvenile salmon to eat.
So the narrative isn't as simple as just pumps equal death. It's a toxic cocktail of drought, warming waters, invasive clams completely reshaping the food web, and massive pumps equal death. But why, listener, does this specific debate about the Delta smelt matter so intensely to you? Why does a finger-length translucent fish generate hundreds of millions of dollars in lobbying, endless federal lawsuits, and bitter political warfare?
Because of all those compounding factors, the pumps are the one massive lever the state and federal government directly controls. You cannot legislate a multi-year drought out of existence.
Right.
You cannot easily mandate the eradication of billions of invasive clams scattered across the floor of an estuary, but you can order a facility manager to turn down a pump.
And that's the rub. If you have almonds or pistachios or canned tomatoes in your pantry right now, there is a very high likelihood they were grown in the Central Valley using water that was pulled backward through this exact estuary.
Yeah.
The fight over how much water must stay in the delta to protect the endangered fish, what are known as the Bay Delta flow fights, is California's most bitter water quarrel.
Yeah.
Because the answer to that question dictates billions of dollars in water allocation.
If environmental regulations force the pumps to be turned down to stop the reverse flows and save the remaining fish, that means millions of acre-feet of water do not go to the modern industrial agricultural empire of the San Joaquin Valley, and they do not go to the sprawling urban water districts of Southern California.
It is the ultimate high-stakes collision. It is a direct conflict between the senior in-stream rights of the biology that the system was built over and the modern massive economic demands of the system itself. Every single gallon left in the delta to keep the salinity down and protect the smelt is a gallon not delivered to a farm or a municipality.
It's a deeply broken, heavily contested, and incredibly fragile reality. We have paper rights that the tribal nations can't use because the treaties were hidden.
Yeah.
We have massive concrete dams killing salmon with heat and cutting off historic habitats. We have giant industrial pumps forcing rivers backward and driving a bellwether species to functional extinction. It is a very dark, sobering picture of what happens when engineering completely ignores biology and history.
It is dark. But it is not the only narrative playing out in the state right now. To see a different path, to see what happens when the architecture actually attempts to undo itself, we have to shift our geography one last time.
Right.
We are leaving the deeply broken, engineered system of the Delta and moving far to the north, straddling the rugged California-Oregon border. We are going to a river that is telling a very different story right now. We are heading to the Klamath River.
If the story of the Central Valley over the last century is about building massive walls to control nature, the story of the Klamath River right now is about tearing them down.
We are talking about a monumental achievement that culminated just recently in 2024. For over a century, the main stem of the Klamath River had been choked by a series of aging hydroelectric dams operated by a company called Pacificor. Specifically, we are talking about 4 distinct dams: Iron Gate, Copco number 1, Copco number 2, and J.C. Boyle.
And to be clear on the engineering here, these dams weren't built for massive water storage or flood control like Shasta or Frant. They didn't have massive reservoirs designed to supply agriculture miles away. They were primarily built to generate electricity for the region, but the biological effect on the river was exactly the same. They formed an impenetrable, massive wall, sealing off hundreds of miles of the upper river basin from the migrating salmon and steelhead.
They also created massive reservoirs of stagnant, warming water that bred toxic algae blooms every summer, poisoning the river downstream and devastating the local communities. But unlike the Central Valley, where the dams went up and stayed up, on the Klamath, a unique coalition formed to fight back.
It was a decades-long battle, driven relentlessly by the advocacy, the legal maneuvering, and the cultural absolute necessity of the Klamath Basin tribes.
Specifically, the Yurok, Karuk, Hoopa Valley, and Klamath tribes.
Yes. And a staggering multi-state agreement was finally reached. The tribes, working alongside environmental groups, commercial fishermen, and eventually the states of California and Oregon, forced Pacificor to realize that upgrading the aging dams to modern environmental standards would actually cost more than simply removing them. And so, in 2023 and 2024, those 4 dams were removed.
I really want to highlight the sheer staggering scale of this engineering feat. It is not just a dam removal. It is the largest, most complex dam removal and river restoration project in the history of the United States.
By far.
You don't just blow up a 100-foot concrete dam. They had to meticulously draw down the toxic reservoirs, manage millions of cubic yards of accumulated sediment so it didn't completely choke the river downstream, and carefully dismantle millions of tons of concrete, rebar, and earth, slowly returning a massive, powerful river to its historic channel.
And the successful removal reopened roughly 420 miles of historical salmon and steelhead habitat that had been completely sealed off. In some of the upper reaches, fish had been blocked since COPCO 1 was completed in 1918.
1918.
It is an unprecedented massive reversal of the 20th century engineering paradigm that assumed we could just wall off a river forever.
And the most amazing emotional part of this story is the biological response. It wasn't a slow, theoretical trickle. It was practically instantaneous. Let's look at the timeline, because it is astonishing.
It really is.
The final cofferdam, the very last physical barrier holding back the flow, was breached on September 26, 2024. The river ran free, unencumbered from the mountains to the ocean for the first time in over a century.
And then the biologists, the tribal members, and the engineers waited. They had prepared the habitat, they had planted millions of native seeds along the old reservoir footprints, and they hoped the fish would return. But nobody could guarantee how long it would actually take for the salmon to realize the barrier was gone.
But they didn't have to wait long at all. By mid-October 2024, we are talking mere weeks, literally just days after the final barrier was removed. California Department of Fish and Wildlife biologists documented adult fall-run Chinook salmon actively swimming and spawning in tributaries above the former dam sites.
Specifically, they documented large, healthy fish utilizing Jenny Creek, which is a tributary located about 4.3 river miles upstream from where the massive Iron Gate Dam used to sit.
Incredible.
Those were the first anadromous fish to reach that specific gravel, to return to that ancestral spawning ground, since Iron Gate was completed in 1961.
Mere weeks. Think about the biological drive that requires. It's like the river had a phantom limb for 60 years, and the moment the tourniquet was removed, the blood, the life force rushed right back in.
That's a great analogy.
The genetic instinct of those fish to push upstream into waters their ancestors hadn't touched in over half a century is absolutely incredible. It feels like a total triumph.
It is a stunning, deeply moving biological indicator. It proves unequivocally that if you remove the physical barrier, if you stop choking the system and give the river a chance, the fish will attempt to reclaim their historic habitat immediately.
But I hear the tone in your voice. There is a very important but coming here. I know you're going to temper my excitement, aren't you?
I have to, because while the speed of those initial spawners pushing up into Jenny Creek is a real, glorious, and deeply emotional result, it is crucial from a scientific standpoint to frame this honestly. This is a beginning. It is not a victory lap.
Right. It's not a Hollywood movie where the dam breaks, the music swells, the fish leap over the rubble, and the ecosystem is instantly magically healed by the time the credits roll.
Unfortunately, no.
The damage of a century is not undone in a month. I'd imagine it's more like a physical therapy regimen for a river. A really, really long, painful physical therapy regimen after a massive trauma.
That's a very accurate, sobering way to look at it. The initial return of a few dozen or even a few hundred fish to a tributary does not mean the run has recovered. The system is still deeply wounded.
So what are we looking at?
NOAA models suggest that while Chinook returns could rise substantially over the next 30 years as the habitat stabilizes, biologists expect full recolonization and demographic stability to take 4 or 5 salmon generations.
Just so we have the timeline clear, how long is a salmon generation?
Roughly 3 to 5 years, depending on the specific run and the time they spend in the ocean. So we are realistically talking about a timeline of roughly 12 to 25 years before we see anything resembling a fully recovered, resilient, harvestable population in the upper basin.
So what are the massive challenges that still lie ahead? Why will it take decades for the river to truly heal?
Because the river doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is deeply connected to a rapidly changing global climate. The recovery of the Klamath salmon remains hostage to massive macro-environmental factors. First, they are incredibly vulnerable to shifting ocean conditions.
Right, because they spend so much time out there.
Exactly. Salmon spend the bulk of their adult lives in the Pacific, and marine heat waves and shifting food webs out there can decimate a population before they ever even return to the river.
And what about in the river itself? The dams are gone, but the water quality doesn't just instantly become pristine.
Exactly. They are still vulnerable to massive disease outbreaks in the river, particularly a parasite called sea shasta, which thrives in warm, low-flow conditions and has plagued the Klamath juveniles for years.
Oh, man.
And they are entirely at the mercy of the surrounding landscape. Multi-year droughts will still shrink the river, and catastrophic climate-driven wildfires in the steep surrounding canyons are constantly reshaping the watersheds, causing massive sediment and ash runoff that can completely smother the spawning gravels.
The dams are gone, but the climate is still changing, and the scars on the landscape remain.
The Klamath Dam removal shows us a profound truth. Rivers can heal faster than the skeptics ever claimed. The fish will try to come back. But it also plainly, scientifically demonstrates that a decimated, traumatized run does not come back to historic, harvestable strength in a single season. It requires generational patience, immense scientific monitoring, and continuous, dedicated stewardship.
Which brings us to the crucial task of synthesizing these braided stories we've explored today.
Yeah.
We've talked about the hidden, secret treaties of the 1850s that stole the tribal land base. We've examined the brutal, concrete efficiency of Shasta and Freyant dams that walled off the high country. We've looked at the physics of the reverse flows and the delta pumps driving the Smelt to extinction, and we've just looked at the monumental, slow, hopeful healing of the Klamath.
And when you weave all of those seemingly disparate historical and scientific threads together, a very clear, very stark structural truth emerges about California. Both the migrating salmon and the native nations represent the exact same kind of claim on the state's water. They are both in stream and they are both fundamentally senior.
They are in stream because the biology of the salmon literally requires the water to be left cold and flowing in the river to survive. And the tribes historically relied on those intact flowing rivers for their cultural, spiritual, and physical sustenance.
And their rights are undeniably senior to everything else. The biology of the fish predates human habitation by millennia. And the sovereign presence of the native nations and their implied winter's rights predate the very existence of the state of California, let alone the diversion ditches, the concrete dams, and the industrial pumps that took the water away.
20th century California looked at those senior in-stream claimants and essentially built a dazzling irrigation and urban empire right on top of them. The system used dams without fish ladders, cooking endangered species with mismanaged thermostats. It utilized pumps so massive they reversed the gravity-fed flow of rivers.
Yep.
And it grew incredibly rich on land promised in treaties that the United States Senate secretly hid in a locked drawer for 50 years. The entire multi-billion-dollar plumbing system functioned on the core, arrogant assumption that the senior claimants simply didn't exist.
But reality eventually asserts itself. As we've seen with the spectacular removal of the dams on the Klamath, and as we see in the slow, agonizing, gallon-by-gallon legal work of finally quantifying tribal water rights across the state, the system can only ignore reality for so long.
That's very true.
The breaching of the Klamath dams and the ongoing tribal water settlements are what it looks like when the massive architecture of the 20th century begins, very tentatively, to account for what it intentionally left out.
It is the very beginning of a profound reckoning. And so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We have spent this time detailing how this magnificent, terrifying water system was constructed by ignoring the rights of the river and the tribes. But the law and biology have incredibly long memories.
They really do.
So ask yourself, if the greatest, most productive agricultural and water system on Earth was fundamentally built by hiding the contracts and starving the rivers, well, what happens to that modern empire when the river's oldest true owners finally step forward to collect their due?